Hey guys, welcome back. Today I'll be going into the religious ideas of India. We'll be looking at the earliest strata of the Vedic gods just to see what the religious system was there. And we'll be looking at the two fundamental concepts that arose out of this period, namely Rita, which is cosmic order and truth, as well as Maya, which would be understood as the world as illusion. But we're going to start at the beginning, or rather the beginning of the beginning. And so we'll look into these people. These are the Indo-Europeans, whom go by another name that shall not be mentioned other than using the Sanskrit term Arya. Okay, now these people are fundamental because they introduce certain religious concepts into the Indian subcontinent, which will develop and cause assimilation and cross evolution between the two into a final symbiosis, which will lead into the profound ideas that we know to be contained in Hinduism. Okay, but what can we tell of these people? Well, what we first have to say is that the Indo-Europeans had no writing system. Despite being in contact with the Near East, they seem to have prohibited writing, so there's no textual tracts. Their shrines appear to have been open door shrines or open to the sky. And so, what we can tell from them are not any details, but we can gather certain important fundamental structures of their religiosity and societal structure from the little but valuable insights from religious vocabulary. Okay, so we know that these were a pastoral people. They were pastoral nomads. They followed a patriarchal family structure and they were organized militarily. They had a proclivity towards raiding and warring with other peoples. Okay. We can tell from their religious vocabulary that Diwos, which is the Indo-European root for sky, was meant to mean God. And so there is a sky father. And you see this in Latin as in Deus, in Sanskrit, Deva, in Iran it's Div, and in Old Germanic it is Tivar. So the principal god was the sky god. He was the supreme father. In India, this is called Deus Pitar. In Greek, this is Zeus Pater. And in Latin, we have a certain conflated single word, Jupiter. So what this tells us is that the religious system of the Indo-Europeans was centered around celestial hierophanies. Okay, there's a focus on the sky, and so it's no surprise that we often see in religious systems that stem from the Indo-Europeans the focus on the gods of storm or the gods of thunder. So in German we have Donar or Thor. Among the Celts there was Tyrannus. In the Baltic regions, you had Porkunas, in Proto-Slavic, Peru. And just as is seen in many times across the world where the younger, dynamic storm god overtakes the older sky god, it is very likely that a similar process was occurring among the Indo-Europeans. Now, another fundamental element of their society was their tripartite sociological structure. Okay, and this is important because there is a corresponding religious tripartite structure. So the Indo-Europeans divided their society into three classes: the priests, the warriors, and the farmers. Okay, and this would correspond to a trifunctional religious ideology where you had the god that is magical and juridical, you would have the god of war, and then the god or gods of fecundity and prosperity. Okay, so this is seen in India very clearly, where you have the Brahmin, who were the priests, the Kshatriya, who were the warriors, and then the Vaishya, who were the farmers. Okay, similar structure is found among the Celts. The equivalent of the Brahmin was the Druid. The equivalent of the Kshatriya was Flaith. Flaith literally means power. This was a military aristocracy among the Celts. And then the Boerig were the freemen who owned cattle. Now, when we look at, for example, in the Roman religious system, we don't necessarily find this societal structure, but we do have a vestige of the religious structure maintained in Rome. So the Capitoline triad of Jupiter as sovereign, Mars as the god of war, and Quirinius, the god of prosperity. Likewise, in Scandinavia, you have Odin, Thor, who was the champion, and then Frey, the god of fecundity. Now, what's interesting, and what will become important later, is that when we look at this first class, the class of the Kshatriya, the class of the Brahmin, or the class of the Druid, this aspect was actually divided into two complementary parts. One part was the magical sovereignty, and the other part was the juridical sovereignty. And we see this especially clear in Varuna and Mitra. Okay, so Mitra was the sovereign god in his clear, reasoning, benevolent, calm, and ordered aspect, whereas Varuna was the sovereign god in his somber, violent, and warlike aspect. Okay, so that is an important distinction that will come about later when we're talking about Reta and Maya. Okay, so these are some of the generalizations that we can uncover from the Indo-Europeans. And now when we come to the Indo-European, or specifically the Indo-Aryan, the Indo-Iranian invasion of northern India, we see that now we're going to have two conflicting religious systems. The nomadic pastoralists, who are the Indo-Iranians, and then also the native Harappan culture that was the Indus Valley civilization. So the advance of the Indo-Iranians began in the second millennium BC. Within 5 centuries, they then were occupying the Punjab. And the importance of the Vedas in this connection is that the Vedas, or the hymns within them, that were written much later, are essentially a mythological memory of this event. And so you can uncover certain aspects of this within the hymns. Okay, so the Vedic texts speak of battles against the Desa, or the Desu, in whom we may recognize the survivors of the original Harappan or Indus Valley civilization. Okay, they were described as darker skinned, noseless, and speaking a foreign language. All right, they lived in fortified settlements called Pur. And what's interesting here is that when we look at the god Indra, who is named Purandara, the destroyer of fortifications, seems to indicate perhaps how they attacked and ruined these fortifications by the hundreds. Now, the Arya, or the Indo-Iranians, they had no cities, they knew nothing of writing. They were governed by military chiefs called Rajas. And when the Arya would occupy a new territory, they would legitimize the territory by building an altar to the god Agni. And Agni, again, is one of those root words of fire which you will find in many parts of the world where the Indo-Europeans had spread and or invaded. Now, the significance of this was that in the Indo-European mindset, as you would see among many primitive or hunter-gatherer societies, is that outside of the tribe, or outside of the city-state, so to speak, is the uncreated world. It's the world of chaos. It's the world of darkness. And so when they would acquire new territory, they would build an altar to the fire, to the cult of domestic fire, to the god Agni, to bring light. It was sort of a symbolic representation, an imitation of creation, that by bringing light, they were extending the cosmos. Okay, so the god Agni, especially will be important in the next video in this series, when it comes to priesthood and sacrifice. Okay, but when it comes to all this, the invasion, the occupation, the creative power of the Indian spirit lies in the process of symbiosis, assimilation, and revalorization that first led to the Indo-Iranianization of India and later to Hinduization. This process took many thousands of years. It was a dialogue between these two religious systems, if you will, and a dialogue that found its religious unity in the writings and meditations of the poet philosophers in the Vedas. Okay, and this is what we're going to see now. So we're going to go into the primordial divinity of the Vedas. Okay, Varuna. Now, when we're talking about the Vedas, we have to again remember that the hymns do not present the oldest form of Vedic religion. We were saying how the Indo-Iranian um, invaders had the sky god, okay, Deus. Um, Deus, by the time of the Vedas, is no longer meaning God of the sky, but rather is being turned into simply sky or day. And yet there are still some vestiges of this memory. So we read in the Vedic poets that, quote, the sky that knows all. And on occasion they still invoke the sky father, Deus Pitar. But it's evident within the Vedas that Deus is being taken over by Varuna as the supreme sovereign god, although the exact stages of this are not fully known. Okay? So Varuna is designated as an asura, along with other gods like Agni. Now, the asuras constitute the most ancient divine family. In the Vedic texts, they speak of an opposing set of gods known as the Devas. Now, this particular conflict between the asuras and Devas will be talked about at length in the post-Vedic period in the Brahmanas, who will use this material to delve into the mystery of sacrifice. Okay, but in our purposes, the conflict between these two divine groups, Devas and Asuras, which again you see in many mythological systems across the world, when it turns to the Olympians and the Titans, etc., it signifies a change in epoch. All right, the previous epoch, ruled by the older primordial deities, is now being swayed into the newer epoch. Okay, so what we're again getting is Varuna is being presented as the sovereign god. He rules the world, he rules the gods or the devas, and he rules men. He stretched out the earth as a butcher stretches a hide. He put milk in cows, intelligence in hearts, fire in the waters, and in the sky he placed the sun. He put Soma on the mountains. He is Visvadarsata, visible everywhere, omniscient and infallible. Yet, despite all this, Varuna is already in decline in the Vedic period. So whereas Deus or Deus Pitar, we have only a few elements, we're already seeing Varuna being taken over. He is far from the popularity of Indra, but he is intimately connected with two religious concepts that will be developed in the future, Rita and Maya. Now we'll start with Rita. Rita designates the order of the universe, okay? An order that is at once cosmic, liturgical, and moral. It's used more than 300 times in the Rig Veda. The Rig Veda is Hinduism's oldest scripture. Creation is said to have been made in conformity with Rita. The gods act according to Rita. Rita rules both cosmic rhythms and moral conduct. Varuna was brought up in the house of Rita. He loves Rita and bears witness to it. He is called the king of Rita. He who breaks the law, he who breaks the cosmic order, the cosmic truth, is responsible before Varuna. So Rita, again as cosmic order and truth, is deeply connected with Varuna. So now we have a dilemma. If Rita, cosmic order and truth, is connected with Varuna, how can that also be connected to Maya? Now, Maya, as it will be developed some nearly 2,000 years after this, as the world as illusion, right? So, how can we connect these two, right? Well, it makes sense if we understand that Varuna's cosmic creativity has a magical side. So, like we were talking about when it came to the first strata of society, or the first strata of the cosmic triad, or the mythological triad, there is a division between two complementary aspects, the magical and the judicial. And that's what we're seeing come into play here. The word Maya derives from the root word may, which means to change. In the Rig Veda, again, Hinduism's oldest scripture, Maya designates destructive change. It can also designate deceitful change. In other words, there are two forms of Maya. You can have good Maya and evil Maya. All right? There's a demonic type, which will be looked at later with the serpent Virtra, who's a trickster. And then there are good Mayas, and the good Mayas are two in form. You have the Maya of combat, the counter Maya, like when Indra uses Maya to challenge a demonic being. But then there is also the Maya that creates forms and beings. This is a cosmologic Maya, which can be regarded as equivalent to Rita. Okay? So this Maya is connected to Rita, to the cosmic order. So in the Rig Veda, some 1500 years before classic Vedanta, we can perceive the first meaning of Maya as intentional change. That is, alteration, creative or destructive, and then an alteration of alteration. It's important to note that the origin of the philosophical concept of Maya as cosmic illusion, unreality, and non-being is found at once in the idea of change, an alteration of a cosmic norm and therefore demonic transformation, and in the idea of the creative power of Varuna, who by virtue of Maya reestablishes the order of the universe. Okay, so at this point, Maya has a certain dual definition that can also be beneficial. And so we can see how from this, how Maya would become to mean cosmic illusion later down the line. It's because it implies both demonic alteration and cosmic order, but also divine creativity. Later, the cosmos itself will become for Vedanta an illusionary transformation. In other words, a system of changes devoid of reality. Okay. So those are the two fundamental concepts connected with Varuna. And now we go into Indra. In the Rig Veda, Indra is the most popular god. There are some 250 hymns addressed to him. Compared to this, to the only 10 that are dedicated to Varuna. Indra is the paradigmatic model for warriors. He is also a demiurge, a creator. He is the personification of cosmic and biological life. He's the tireless consumer of soma, the archetype of generative forces. He pours down rain and commands all forms of wetness. The central myth of Indra, which is also the most important myth in the Rig Veda, depicts his victorious battle against Virtra, the gigantic dragon who held back the waters in the hollows of the mountain. Indra, strengthened by Soma and with his Vajra, thunderbolt, laid the dragon low and finally splitting his head open, which released the waters. Okay, now this, a god utilizing thunder, you have reminiscence of Thor, but the concept of a god doing battle with a marine deity or marine monster is also a very common mythological theme. All right. We see this, for example, with Zeus and Typhon, but we also see it in Sumeria with Ninurta and Asag, with Marduk and Tiamat. All right? It is a very common theme, and the reason is that the marine monster, the marine deity, is a symbol for chaos. And so the slaying of this monster represents the subduing of chaos to order and a new cosmic creation being brought into existence. Indra's victory represents the triumph of life over sterility and death. By his victory, Indra created the sun, the sky, and the dawn. After this creative feat, Indra appoints Varuna as the cosmocrator and guardian of Rita. The lesson here is that violence makes life up. It makes life spring, it increases it, and it regenerates it. Okay. Now we're briefly going to look at the god Agni. The cult of the domestic fire goes back into prehistory. In the Vedas, the god Agni supremely represents the sacrality of fire. He is born in the sky and descends as lightning. He is also identified with the sun. There is mention of his flaming hair, his golden jaw, and the noise and the terror that he produces. He is the messenger between sky and earth, and through him offerings are made to the gods. But above all, he is the archetype of the priest. Okay, so this is what's going to segue into my next video on the religious ideas of India, and I hope you found this informative and interesting. I think this part of the world is extremely fascinating and brought about some truly, truly amazing ideas. Anyway, folks, take care, be well.